There are some people the world mistakes for immortal, not because they never age, but because their image becomes frozen in time. For decades, the world looked at Paul McCartney and saw something almost untouchable. The charming Beatle, the melodic genius, the smiling face behind songs that helped define the 20th century. But behind that smile, behind the melodies that millions used to soundtrack their happiest memories, there was another man entirely. A man who spent most of his life running from grief. And now, at 83 years old, the silence around him feels heavier than ever. Because the tragedy of Paul McCartney was never one dramatic collapse. It was something slower. Something quieter. A lifetime of emotional losses hidden beneath applause loud enough to drown out almost anything. Almost. The story begins in Liverpool. Long before the stadiums. Long before the hysteria. Before fame transformed four young men into perhaps the most recognizable faces on earth. Paul was just a boy growing up in post-war England, in a household shaped by modesty, music, and emotional restraint. His father, Jim McCartney, was disciplined and practical. A former jazz musician who loved melody but understood hardship more than fantasy. His mother, Mary, was the emotional center of the family. Warm, hard-working, dependable, and Paul adored her. Years later, people would talk endlessly about the songs, the records, the genius. But those who truly understood Paul often pointed to one defining emotional fracture that shaped everything that came after. He lost his mother when he was only 14 years old. Breast cancer. One day she was there. And then suddenly she wasn't. The grief was devastating. But what made it worse was the silence surrounding it. In working-class Liverpool during the 1950s, boys were not encouraged to unravel emotionally. Pain was swallowed. Tears were private. Life simply moved forward whether your heart was ready or not. And Paul learned very early how to survive emotional devastation by hiding inside music. That wound would follow him forever. Years later, when he met another teenage boy carrying almost the exact same trauma, a boy named John Lennon, whose own mother had also died tragically, the connection between them became immediate and unusually deep. People often described Lennon and McCartney as opposites. John was sharp-edged, rebellious, emotionally volatile. Paul was polished, charming, controlled. But underneath those differences was something darker they shared. Abandonment, loss, the feeling that life could rip away the people you loved without warning. And together they escaped into music. By the early 1960s, the Beatles became more than a band. It became a global phenomenon unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. The screaming crowds, the chaos, the pressure. Fame arrived so fast that none of them emotionally processed what was happening. And for Paul, success became both salvation and prison. Because while the world saw glamour, the reality behind Beatlemania was exhaustion, isolation, and emotional suffocation. The young men at the center of it were barely in their 20s, yet they lived inside a level of global obsession that bordered on psychological imprisonment. Every movement documented, every word analyzed, every mistake amplified. Paul responded to that pressure by becoming hyper-functional. While others spiraled emotionally, he pushed harder into work. Writing, recording, organizing, controlling. It became his coping mechanism. Even then, people close to the band noticed something unusual about him. Beneath the confidence and humor was someone terrified of emotional collapse. He kept moving because stopping meant confronting feelings he had buried since childhood. And then came another devastating emotional shift. At the height of Beatlemania, the band lost their manager, Brian Epstein. Epstein had been far more than a businessman. He was stabilizing force, protector, strategist, emotional buffer. His death in 1967 shattered the fragile structure holding the group together. Suddenly, the cracks inside the Beatles became impossible to ignore. Creative tensions escalated. Personal resentments deepened. Drug use distorted communication. And Paul, desperate to keep the band alive, became increasingly controlling. To the outside world, it looked like arrogance. But psychologically, it looked more like panic. The one thing that gave his life structure, the thing that helped him survive grief, was beginning to disintegrate in front of him. And perhaps the most painful part was watching his relationship with John Lennon slowly deteriorate. For years, they had operated almost like emotional counterparts. Competitive, protective, resentful, dependent. Their bond was too complicated to fit into ordinary friendship. But as the late 1960s unfolded, misunderstandings hardened into bitterness. John became increasingly distant after meeting Yoko Ono. Paul felt abandoned. John felt controlled. Neither fully understood how to communicate the hurt beneath the anger. And eventually, the greatest songwriting partnership in modern history collapsed under the weight of ego, exhaustion, fame, and emotional wounds neither man truly healed from. When the Beatles officially broke apart in 1970, the world treated it like celebrity news. For Paul, it felt closer to a death. He later admitted he spiraled into depression during that period. He drank heavily, stayed isolated on his farm in Scotland, questioned whether life even had direction anymore. Imagine reaching the top of human success, only to discover it could still leave you emotionally empty. The world blamed him for the breakup. Fans turned hostile. Critics mocked him. And beneath all of it was a man barely holding himself together psychologically. One of the cruelest ironies of Paul McCartney's life is that the very thing that made him beloved, his optimism, often prevented people from noticing how deeply wounded he actually was. Because smiling people are easier to misunderstand. And by the early 1970s, Paul McCartney was no longer just grieving a band. He was grieving an entire version of himself that no longer existed. But what came next would shape the emotional core of the rest of his life. Because soon, he would meet the woman who finally made him feel safe again. And decades later, losing her would nearly destroy him. By the time the 1970s began, Paul McCartney was emotionally exhausted. The world assumed he had everything: money, fame, freedom. But internally, he was drifting. The collapse of the Beatles had left him psychologically shattered in ways he rarely admitted publicly. Critics attacked him relentlessly. Former fans blamed him for the breakup. Music journalists treated him like the villain who destroyed the most beloved band in history. And perhaps worst of all, his relationship with John Lennon had become painfully fractured. For a man who spent his life terrified of abandonment, it felt like history repeating itself. Another emotional home disappearing. Another person he loved becoming unreachable. But in the middle of that chaos, there was one person who slowly pulled him back from emotional collapse: Linda McCartney. When Paul met Linda in the late 1960s, she was unlike most people orbiting celebrity culture. She was independent, grounded, artistic, emotionally direct. She didn't seem hypnotized by fame the way others often were. And for Paul, that mattered deeply. Because by then, he no longer knew who genuinely loved him, and who loved the idea of being close to Paul McCartney. Linda became more than a wife. She became emotional shelter. The one place where the performance could stop. People sometimes mocked their relationship publicly. Critics dismissed Linda's musical abilities when she joined Paul in his new band, Wings. Audiences could be cruel. Music reviewers often portrayed her as untalented or undeserving. But Paul defended her constantly. Not because he believed she was technically perfect, but because she represented something far more important to him than public approval. Stability, family, normalcy. After years of hysteria, manipulation, and emotional chaos, Linda helped him build a life that felt human again. They escaped the machinery of celebrity whenever possible. They raised children away from some of the madness. They spent time on farms, cooked together, lived quietly when they could. And for perhaps the first time since childhood, Paul seemed emotionally safe. But trauma has a strange way of lingering beneath happiness. Even during successful years with Wings, there were signs that Paul carried unresolved emotional fear everywhere he went. He worked compulsively, rarely slowed down, constantly created, constantly performed, as if silence itself frightened him. Then came 1980, and one phone call that changed him forever. When John Lennon was murdered outside the Dakota in New York City, Paul's world was shaken in ways almost impossible to articulate. Their relationship had improved somewhat in the years before John's death, but it remained complicated. There were still tensions, still unfinished conversations, still emotional distance that neither fully resolved. And suddenly, there would never be another chance. No final reconciliation, no old age friendship, no closure, just shock. People still remember the infamous moment when reporters approached Paul after the murder and asked for his reaction. Visibly stunned and emotionally overwhelmed, he quietly said, "It's a drag." Those 3 words haunted him for years. Many interpreted the comment as cold or detached. But trauma often destroys language. Human beings in shock rarely produce eloquent grief. Sometimes pain becomes so overwhelming that the brain reaches for the simplest possible sentence just to survive the moment. Privately, Paul was devastated, not only because John died, but because part of his own identity died with him. No one else on earth fully understood what they had experienced together. Not fame, not pressure, not the screaming crowds, not the psychological weight of becoming global mythology while still emotionally young men. After John's death, Paul became increasingly aware of mortality. Friends were disappearing. Time was accelerating. And the world still demanded endless performances from him as though he were frozen permanently in 1964. Then, in the 1990s, another unimaginable tragedy arrived. Linda was diagnosed with breast cancer, the same disease that had killed Paul's mother decades earlier. The emotional cruelty of that coincidence is almost unbearable to think about. The woman who helped heal his deepest wounds, now facing the exact illness connected to his earliest trauma. Paul threw himself into caring for her. He stayed close constantly. Friends later described him as fiercely devoted during her illness. He tried to protect her from media intrusion while emotionally preparing himself for something he clearly did not want to accept. And in 1998, Linda died. She was only 56 years old. For Paul, the loss was catastrophic. People close to him described a man completely shattered by grief. Not performative grief. Not celebrity mourning. Real devastation. He had built nearly 30 years of emotional life around Linda. Their routines, their private jokes, their children, their home life, all of it suddenly collapsed into silence. And beneath that grief was something even darker. A horrifying sense of repetition. First his mother, now Linda, both taken by the same disease. It forced Paul to relive emotional pain he had carried since adolescence. Except now he was older, more tired, and painfully aware that life was running out. What made the tragedy even heavier was the strange loneliness of public grief. The world mourned Linda as Paul McCartney's wife. But for Paul, she was the person who made survival possible after the Beatles fell apart. Without her, he seemed emotionally untethered again. In interviews after her death, there were moments where his usual charm cracked visibly. You could hear exhaustion beneath the humor, a quiet sadness that never fully disappeared. Yet the machine of fame never stopped. Concerts continued. Appearances continued. Expectations continued. The public still wanted Paul McCartney the icon. But inside, the man himself was aging beneath layers of unresolved grief stretching back almost his entire life. And then, just when it seemed he might finally rebuild emotionally once again, another relationship would pull him into one of the most humiliating and painful public chapters of his entire existence. A chapter that exposed how even legends can become heartbreakingly vulnerable to loneliness. There is something deeply unsettling about watching legends grow old. Not because aging itself is tragic, but because the world often refuses to let them be human. For decades, Paul McCartney existed almost like a permanent symbol of youth. The smile, the melodies, the endless optimism. Even as generations changed, people still looked at him and saw the same young man from Liverpool standing beneath screaming lights in the 1960s. But time does not spare anyone. And eventually, even icons are forced to confront loneliness, regret, and emotional exhaustion. After the death of Linda McCartney, Paul entered one of the most emotionally fragile periods of his life. Friends described him as deeply vulnerable. The stability that had protected him for decades was suddenly gone, and beneath his public composure was a man quietly terrified of being alone again. That fear mattered more than most people realized, because Paul had spent his entire life attaching emotional survival to connection. First his mother, then John Lennon, then Linda. Every time he lost someone central to his emotional world, a part of him seemed to collapse inward. And in the early 2000s, that vulnerability led him into a relationship that would become one of the most painful public humiliations of his life. When Paul married Heather Mills in 2002, Many observers immediately sensed emotional imbalance beneath the glamorous headlines. Mills was outspoken, controversial, and frequently at war with the British press. Paul, meanwhile, appeared desperate for emotional closeness after years of devastating grief. At first, he seemed genuinely hopeful. But over time, the relationship became increasingly turbulent and public. Arguments spilled into media coverage. Interviews turned hostile. Allegations emerged from both sides. And suddenly, one of the most beloved musicians in history found himself trapped inside a bitter tabloid spectacle. For someone who valued privacy emotionally, it was deeply damaging. The divorce became brutal. Financial disputes dominated headlines. Private details became public entertainment. His reputation was scrutinized relentlessly. At times, the coverage felt less like journalism and more like public dissection. And perhaps what made the situation so psychologically painful was how exposed he suddenly looked. People who once viewed Paul as untouchable now saw an aging man appearing emotionally lost, vulnerable to manipulation, and unable to control the chaos surrounding his personal life. For decades, he had survived fame through careful emotional management. Now that control was slipping. The court battle drained him visibly. Even longtime fans noticed a heaviness in his demeanor during those years. He looked older, wearier, less guarded. And underneath the headlines was a sadder truth rarely discussed openly. Paul McCartney was confronting the terrifying reality of aging while carrying emotional wounds accumulated over an entire lifetime. By then, many of the people who defined his emotional universe were gone. George Harrison had died in 2001 after battling cancer. John Lennon had been gone for decades. Linda was gone. Even the cultural world that once belonged to the Beatles no longer truly existed. Time had transformed it into mythology. Imagine surviving long enough to watch your own life become historical footage. To younger generations, Paul became less of a man and more of an artifact. An icon people admired without fully understanding the psychological cost behind the image. And yet, he kept performing. That may be one of the most heartbreaking aspects of Paul McCartney's story. He never stopped working. Even in his 80s, he continued touring massive stadiums, writing music, appearing in documentaries, giving interviews, smiling for cameras. Some people saw it as passion. Others quietly wondered whether he knew how to exist without constant motion. Because work had always protected him from grief. Silence was dangerous. Stillness allowed memories to surface. And those memories were enormous. The mother he lost at 14. The friendship with John Lennon that ended in tragedy. The impossible pressure of Beatlemania. The years spent carrying blame for the Beatles' breakup. Linda's death. Public humiliation. The gradual disappearance of almost everyone who remembered who he was before fame consumed him. There is also another sadness that comes with surviving this long in public life. People stop asking how you really are. They assume wealth protects you from pain. They assume success eliminates loneliness. They assume legends become emotionally invincible. But aging often magnifies grief instead of healing it. Especially for someone whose entire identity was built around connection, creativity, and emotional memory. In recent years, Paul has occasionally spoken more openly about loss, dreams, and mortality. He has described dreaming about John Lennon, reflecting on Linda, revisiting old memories with increasing emotional softness. There are moments now where he seems less interested in protecting the myth of Paul McCartney, and more willing to acknowledge the fragile human being underneath it. And maybe that is the true tragedy of his life. Not fame itself, not even loss itself, but the unbearable contradiction of being one of the most loved men on earth, while repeatedly experiencing devastating emotional isolation behind closed doors. Because the crowds never really stop for people like Paul McCartney. The applause continues. The songs continue. The legend continues. But eventually, after the lights fade and the audience disappears, there is still an aging man left alone with memories powerful enough to haunt an entire lifetime. And perhaps that is why his story feels so heartbreaking now. Not because the world forgot him, but because the world loved the icon so intensely. It almost never noticed the wounded human being quietly surviving beneath it the entire time.